Okay. Mr. Ray, how are we going to proceed?
Well, I think if we want to be done in 90 minutes, I would say...
We have people who want to testify.
Okay.
So it's not just us talking to each other.
Okay. Well, let me very briefly then just review a couple points of the staff report,
right,
and then maybe I return it back to you to choose how to proceed. I think one of the things that will most be important early on is to talk about what do we mean by protecting the Delta as a place, as an evolving place, and what does it mean to determine that projects are feasible, too. So one thing that we've tried to do in the staff report is we've referred to because that's one of the tests for which portion of the proposals we would involve and have to be feasible. And so one thing we've done is refer back to the definition of feasible that's in the code. It's got to be capable of being accomplished in a successful manner in a reasonable period of time, taking into account, social, economic, and other factors. And so that's one of the ways that we've looked at the proposals that are included in the Commission's plans. We've also tried to lay out our own view of what it means to protect the Delta as an evolving place. We started with the guidance that was in the Delta Vision Report that meant acceptance that change won't stop, but that there's fundamental characteristics and values that make the Delta a special place and distinguish it from other places that we ought to try to preserve and enhance while we accommodate these changes. It doesn't mean making the Delta a preserve or a museum or a fortress. It means that we can manage some changes, the ones that aren't beyond our control or that are maybe required to attain some of the attributes of the co-equal goals. But we can manage those so that we can protect the Delta's economy and honor its traditions and involve its residents in the decisions about their future. And so that's how we've tried to think about the proposals that were put before us. That's one of the reasons that economic vitality of the region is essential, so that it's got the capacity to respond to and participate in change and isn't just the victim of outside forces. So with that, if you'd like to go through individual recommendations that we may have made in our Table 1, the staff report, or whether you want to take testimony.
Tell you what I'm doing. I don't know the right way to proceed. One option is we start working through the 38 recommendations in the order in which the DPC presented them. That may be the best way. One possibility is we just do a discussion. We've got the chart that was in the Economic Sustainability Plan report that summarizes their argument, their recommendation. We have the separate chart from Dan that indicates his reflections, which roughly 2/3 appear to be acceptable now in the staff view, our staff view. We could do that and then choice, open it for questions and comments on that point from the audience. Now, we're not voting on this, obviously, pursuant to the earlier discussion, because the staff has to check this with comments in the EIR and all the other stuff, but it will be coming back for their final recommendations on inclusion items. That's one way to do it. What do you think? The other is take a section. The first is the levies and public safety recommendations. Do all the sections, then open it up for comments from the audience and so on. I don't know. I'm open to suggestions.
John? Well, I think this certainly section by section probably gives you a little more context to work with, and where you have consistency or some determination otherwise.
Right.
And again, I guess I would just turn to Mike. Is that comfortable from the standpoint of being able to respond to concerns? We can get to section by section.
We can do that.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. Let's just start off with the 8 recommendations under the levy and public safety recommendations. We've had the general discussion. Do you want to start with the first one in the list?
Well, maybe what I might be able to do is just frame these up in terms of the way that it was thought about. And one thing to remember is that the proposals that are included in the ESP, they affect every chapter in the Delta Plan from governance to science. So our entire staff has been involved. All our entire planning staff has been involved in reviewing these, and so I'm trying to reflect on their points of view. I think, the The current draft of the plan proposes continuing the subventions program, and so policy 3, would be is certainly something we could support. And the idea in the current plan is that's an interim step until levy improvements can be prioritized. And so because the current draft of the plan calls for setting priorities for the delta levies, and because we're uncertain about the feasibility of funding upgrades to all levies to PL 8499 in a reasonable period of time, we really felt that those weren't consistent with the way the plan is currently set up, the objectives that are proposed, and with the Reform Act. One of the concerns that I certainly have is just with the availability of funds, even if projects are cost effective, and there are certainly many projects with positive benefit cost ratios all across the country that never rise to the level of getting any funds. I think of them, if I understand the data we have from DWR and kind of representative costs of levy improvements, it might be $500 million to bring the remaining levies up to 84.99 if we just used the kind of standard cost per mile. As I understand the proposal for the FAT levies, that's an additional $4 billion beyond the $500 million. And then, of course, additional levy improvements are proposed to bring the legacy communities up to a standard that would approach the 100-year flood protection dollars. And then we heard from the state DWR the morning that the improvements for the state plan of flood control inside the Delta, that would be the Yolo bypass, the upgrades for urban levees in the San Joaquin area, that South San Joaquin bypass and other improvements, that's $9.2 billion. So all of a sudden we're talking about real money, and there may be some need to set priorities within that, even if there was to be a choice that every levy ought to be improved to the PL 8499, we might want to set some priorities that said, hey, first priority ought to be here, and the second priority ought to be there, and the third priority ought to be someplace else. So right now I think our feeling is that's a recommendation we can't endorse. The transfer to a regional agency of authority on levy beneficiaries to assess them, that may be a good idea. I think we need to understand more about how that might work, or why there's benefits to doing that over the way it's been done now. Certainly ongoing funding for levy maintenance is a responsibility of local agencies under the current law, and that's not something that ought to be, when folks ought not to assume that would be transferred to the state. Regulatory impediments, one-stop permitting, that's always a desirable activity. Folks always say, hey, let's do that. It's easier said than done. It might be a potential role for the Regional Economic Sustainability Agency or the DSC. And certainly the focus on improving and carrying out hazard reduction, kind of emergency response activity is a great idea.